好，各位华美人文学会的朋友们，大家好！大家可以听到我的声音吗？如果可以听到我的声音，那么请您在我们的对话框打一个1，让我来知道一下，可以吗？好的，非常感谢大家。好的，那么非常感谢大家，以及欢迎大家再一次来到我们华美人文学会的周末讲座系列。我是主持人刘畅。那么今天我们的话题啊，就是围绕3个字来进行，就是传教士。那传教士呢，从这个字面意义上来说，顾名思义就是传播宗教的人士哈。那么我们大家对传教士呢，多多少少也都有所耳闻。那么自鸦片战争之后，传教士在中国进行了广泛的一个这个活动的传播。那么其实除了宗教之外啊，那么传教士对中国的这个近当代社会的各个方面，其实都起到了一些非常重要的影响的作用，尤其是在这个教育还有医疗方面。那么今天呢，我们请到的这位教授专家，他呢将就是就这个话题在各个方面来进行解读和分析。那么稍后呢，我们华美人文学会的联席主席何勇博士将为大家具体介绍。那么在我们今天的讲座开始之前呢，我还是代表我们华美人文学会来为大家来讲解一下我们今天的整个活动的流程，以及大家需要遵守的一些规则。首先，在您进来之后呢，您的声音还有视频默认都是关闭的。如果您在我们的讲座过程当中，对我们今天的话题有想进行互动，或者说想提问，那么您可以在我们的这个对话框来把您的话题还有问题来就是通过这个文字的形式留下来。那么在我们讲座结束之后呢，我们将留一部分的时间来对我们今天的这个话题还有问题来进行这个提问还有互动。所以呢，就是您在我们整个讲座过程当中啊，您都可以来就是留言。那么另外还有一件事情，就是想提醒您，今天我们的这个讲座呢就有所不同，我们今天的讲座将全程用英语来进行讲座，所以呢，您呢，在我们讲座之后，您进行提问，也可以用英语来进行提问，这样我们的这个嘉宾就可以比较直接的来了解您想这个互动的话题。好，那么下面呢，我们就请出我们华美人文学会的联席主席何勇博士为大家来介绍我们今天的这个讲座主题以及我们的嘉宾。何老师。
可以听到我讲话吗？
可以。
Okay, good evening to people in the US and good morning to people in China. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's lecture. In the last week or so, we have had 3 commemorative occasions. The first one was March the 3rd, which marked the centennial or the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Time magazine. Its founder, who also founded the Life magazine, the Fortune magazine, and the Sports Illustrated, was Henry Luce. Henry Luce was the biggest financial supporter for China Institute, to which our Renwen Society belongs. Henry Luce was actively involved in the activities at the China Institute in the first half of the 20th century, and he gifted a building to China Institute. So that building on Upper East Side of New York has been used as the site for China Institute from the end of 1944 to 2015, a total of 70 years. The second commemorative occasion was March the 6th, which marked the 50th anniversary of the death of Pearl Buck, or 赛珍珠 in Chinese. She was a person who needs no introduction, except that she also spoke at China Institute. The third commemorative event was March the 8th, which marked the 130th anniversary of the birth of Dr. Chen Yuguang, president of Jingling University in Nanjing. So Jingling University was known as the Nanjing University outside of China. So he was the first Chinese president and the only Chinese president during the life of Jingling or Nanjing University. So what is common among these three personalities is the American missionary. So both Henry Luce and Pearl Buck were born in missionary families. So Luce was actually born in China in Shandong province, and Buck came to China with her missionary parents not long after she was born. As for Jingling or Nanjing University, it was founded by an American missionary. So American missionaries played a crucial or indispensable role in shaping modern China, and it is the topic of our lecture today. So our esteemed speaker is Professor John Haddad of Penn State University in Harrisburg. He recently published a groundbreaking book entitled Cultures Colliding: American Missionaries, Chinese Resistance, and the Rise of Modern Institutions in China. So it is the book I'm holding in my hand. Yeah, I have been reading the book for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, Professor Haddad is a leading expert on America's historical contact with Asia in general and with China in particular. His two other major books are The Romance of China, Excursions to China in U.S. Culture, 1776 to 1876. The second book is America's First Adventure in China, Trade, Treaties, Opium, and Salvation. Professor Haddad will base today's lecture on his newly published book by focusing on the changes in missionaries' roles and how the changes impacted modern China. So without further ado, I invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Haddad.
Well, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, Yong. And I'd also like to say how much I appreciated your organizational work over these last few weeks. You are probably one of the best people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. It is a true honor to speak at an event hosted by the China Institute, in an organization with a rich history of fostering Sino-American understanding. And as Yong was getting at in his introduction, I think this talk tonight fits nicely under the Institute's mission. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I think we're okay. So what am I talking about? Well, this presentation explains why Protestant missionaries from the United States started building institutions in China. Institutions such as schools, colleges, hospitals, medical schools, museums, printing presses, and YMCA chapters. The origin of my research lies way back in the year 1994. I was teaching at Nankai University in Tianjin. Now, Nankai was not founded by American missionaries. A great educator named Zhang Boling established it in 1904 as a middle school / high school, and 15 years later, he upgraded it to a college. But Zhang had strong connections to one American institution, the YMCA. He was close friends with YMCA secretaries. You can see his good friend there in the photograph, Clarence Robertson. And many of these men taught classes at Nankai. When I taught there, my students told me that Nankai competed against prestigious universities like Beijing University and Tsinghua University, and those were founded by American missionaries. It always struck me as strange that missionaries, people who try to spread religion, were establishing so many colleges in China. They were engaging in a lot of institution building that was not directly related to spreading Christianity, though indirectly it was. Well, when did the institution building start? If you had a time machine and you were able to go back to 1900, you would find lots of American institutions. Oh, about 2,000 churches and chapels, almost 1,000 primary schools, nearly 200 high schools and colleges, 70 hospitals, and almost that many smaller clinics. So that's 1900. If you were to go back further, let's say to 1860 or before, you would encounter almost no institutions other than churches, though you would find a few medical clinics and a handful of schools run by missionary wives. I did not choose 1860 arbitrarily. 1860 was a pivotal year. Before 1860, missionaries were confined to the treaty ports dotting the coastline. It was in 1860 that all of China was thrown open to missionaries thanks to the treaties accompanying the Second Opium War. Missionaries viewed this as a moment of divine significance. God, they believed, had opened China for them. They voyaged to China with a single purpose: to save souls. That's it, nothing else. Their work was purely evangelical. However, by 1900, we see a whole different kind of missionary, the kind who works in an institution. So, what happened during those 4 decades between 1860 and 1900? That's tonight's mystery. So that you can better understand these people, I'll give you an example of each of the 2 kinds of missionary. Here are 2 people you are certainly familiar with. You probably knew them before Yong's introduction, and now you definitely know them. Pearl Buck and Henry Luce. Pearl Buck wrote The Good Earth, a best-selling novel that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1932, and established her as America's foremost literary voice on China. Henry Luce created a media empire in the 20th century that included Time Magazine, Life, Fortune, and when I was growing up, my favorite of all magazines, Sports Illustrated. And as Yong said a moment ago, Luce was also the China Institute's most generous donor. I didn't know that before. And what you may not know is that their fathers were both missionaries in China. But that is where the similarity ends. These 2 dads were cut from a different cloth. Now let me offer you a snapshot of each. Pearl Buck's father, Absalom Seidenstricker, went to China in 1880. He represents the older missionary model, one that dominated the 19th century. Absalom's mission worked something like this. He would put on a Chinese robe and braid his hair into a queue, the required style of the Qing dynasty. He would then mount his donkey and head out, leaving his family for as long as 3 months. Now, Absalom was very tall, and as a giant white man on a small donkey, he cut quite a ridiculous figure out in rural China. And Chinese farmers would stop their work to watch as the strange man clip-clopped by. Though he looked silly, he was deadly serious about planting churches. After arriving at a village, he would preach a sermon in the street, give away Christian literature, and stay long enough to establish a chapel and excite some interest. Before leaving, he would install a minister who would be one of his earlier converts. Then Absalom would go to the next village and repeat. Periodically, he would return to each village to check in, solve problems, and conduct baptisms. Now, to most people alive back then, Absalom seemed to be working on the periphery of civilization. That's not how he viewed it. To him, the Chinese countryside was the center of the cosmos. It was ground zero for God's plan to usher in the new millennium. That made Absalom an agent of God. Now, Pearl Buck described her father as a zealous man, a very inflexible man. But he wasn't a severe man. Chinese Christians adored him, and he loved them back. Now, Absalom had some adventures out there. At some point, he got sick of his donkey and hired a carpenter to build a custom-made wagon. The new wagon could transport him, his belongings, and his boxes of Christian books from village to village. Wheeling around in his fancy contraption, Absalom was the envy of the countryside. But fame would not be his friend. When word of this Godmobile got out, a gang of thieves decided that they wanted to steal it. These robbers ambushed Absalom on the road, seized possession of the vehicle, and hurled his books into a ditch. Refusing to back down, Absalom struck the thieves with his whip, and using his height to great advantage, he cracked their heads together. But there were too many robbers to fend off, and they eventually overwhelmed him. Bruised and bloodied, Absalom walked 30 miles home to his wife and children, wearing only his underwear, because the robbers stole his shoes and clothing too. Was he defeated? Hardly. Absalom could not run a board meeting at a university, but he could survive and perhaps even enjoy a nasty scrape with bandits. This man could run a board meeting. Henry Winters Luce represents a different model of missionary. In 1897, after he had graduated from Yale College and Princeton Seminary, his mission board deployed him to China. Instead of preaching in the countryside, Luce worked at a college. He taught physics, served as department head, and introduced students to a new sport called basketball. After teaching everyone the rules, he arranged the first game ever at his college. During that contest, the students drifted listlessly on the court, too self-conscious to put forward effort in front of their peers. As Luce hollered a steady stream of encouragement, unresponsive students allowed the ball, when it was passed to them, to just drop to the floor. Refusing to quit, Luce continued to push basketball, and eventually the sport gained traction. Chinese students started to bring as much competitive spirit to games as American collegians did, and still do today. Basketball is so popular in China. The mission board, recognizing Luce's social skills and administrative abilities, appointed him vice president of the college and sent him on fundraising tours in the United States. Affable and persuasive, Luce locked up commitments from big donors, the leaders of major corporations. Armed with capital, he expanded the infrastructure of a couple of colleges, creating campus complexes rivaling any in America. As a missionary, he did not save many souls, but he played a key role in bringing modern education to China. So how do we go from Absalom Seidenstricker to Henry Winters Luce? That's the question that guided my research. When I first started out, I had a hypothesis. I expected that the sources would support a narrative of gradual but inevitable evolution along a continuum. That narrative, I predicted, would follow this general arc. After evangelical missionaries, like Absalom, established a beachhead in China, institution-building missionaries, like Luce, would follow. This latter group would fortify and expand Christianity's presence by erecting schools, colleges, and hospitals. In other words, I saw Seidenstricker and Luce as complementary phases of a single initiative. And as I delved into the sources, I expected to find a self-confident America, or American missionaries, inexorably imposing their will over China. I was in for a rude awakening. In missionary accounts, I did not find proud declarations of well-laid plans coming to fruition. Rather, from the crinkly old pages resounded the howls of men and women collectively agonizing over their emotional and physical pain. Instead of glorious triumph, late 19th century missionaries wrote mostly about devastating setbacks, violent mob attacks, burned down churches, desecrated graves, lethal diseases, dying family members, extreme isolation, mental depression, physical exhaustion, and after all that, not turning very many people to Christianity. I was discovering not a record of success, but the existential shock of a grand dream gone awry. So why did the missionary movement reinvent itself? I believe it did so in response to total crisis. Though the crisis was caused by the many problems I listed, mob violence was the most formidable. And I'll give you an example. This is Hunter Corbett. And by the way, get used to guys with beards that extend all the way down to their chest. That seemed to be the vogue for American missionaries. Corbett was an itinerant missionary just like Pearl Buck's father. One bleak December day in 1873, Corbett was traveling by horse across the frozen terrain of Shandong province. His spirits were low since he had recently suffered 2 devastating setbacks. His son died in 1871, 1 year after his birth. That death had precipitated the second tragedy, the physical and emotional collapse of his wife. She died earlier in 1873. Her passing left Corbett bereft of companionship. So to all outward appearances, Hunter Corbett did not pose a threat as he approached his destination. How could he, a sad man on a horse, strike fear into the heart of anyone? And yet, Corbett's arrival provoked a strong reaction. As he approached a village, people started to materialize, with many of them shouting, "Here comes the foreign devil." Now, as long as the hostility remained verbal, Corbett was not worried. He had been called devil countless times before. Unfortunately, his antagonists decided to ratchet up the abuse. As Corbett passed through a market town, The residents lined the streets armed with rocks. As he moved through, they hurled their stones at him. One struck his horse, which immediately bolted forward out of Corbett's control. He was nearly killed. Bruised but not defeated, Corbett traveled to another village holding a festival. Since a festival would attract people, Corbett would enjoy an audience as he preached, or so his reasoning went. As he began his sermon, an ominous crowd gathered around him. When the stones started flying, Corbett ducked into a nearby temple, seeking refuge. Thinking himself safe, he discovered, to his horror, that the mob had followed him in. Cornered, Hunter Corbett feared for his life. At this moment, a Chinese man saw his dire predicament and intervened. "You must get out of harm's way," the kind stranger urged. When Corbett replied that he had no way out, the quick-thinking man seized Corbett's riding whip. Cracking the whip, he plunged into the mob, opening up temporary passage that Corbett ran through. After reaching his horse, Corbett raced out of the village amid a shower of stones. Now that's just one incident, but you can multiply it by 100. This kind of thing happened all the time. Why was there so much hostility? One reason is that Chinese officials sometimes orchestrated resistance behind the scenes. Most officials despised missionaries, and you can understand why. Before 1860, a Chinese official was the most powerful man in his jurisdiction. However, everything changed when the missionary appeared. Protected by treaty rights won during unjust wars, the missionary glowed as a rival power source on the landscape. His mere existence challenged the officials' monopoly on power. The historian John King Fairbank put it this way. He said, quote, "Protestant missionaries and the Chinese local elite were as natural enemies as cats and dogs." So for a variety of reasons, missionary work was miserable in the 1860s and 1870s. And this fact is borne out by statistics. The historian Jessie Lutz compiled research on attrition rates, and she found that 25% of American missionaries in China either quit or died before reaching the 5-year mark. Almost half failed to last a single decade. All right, so it was bad. Now you've heard the expression, crisis breeds invention. In this case, it did. Since conventional preaching was not working, missionaries came up with new ideas to lure the Chinese to Christianity. But what did the Chinese want? Well, for the first time, missionaries started listening to the people they were trying to convert. Here is a short example involving Hunter Corbett. Hunter Corbett collected odd things, and he enjoyed showing them to the Chinese. He had stuffed birds, a rock collection, and several mechanical devices. At first, he gave scarcely a thought to his hobby and the curiosity that it sparked. He, after all, was an itinerant preacher. However, he recognized that it was hard to win converts because so many Chinese felt apprehensive about talking about Christianity. They feared the persecution from friends and family members. In contrast, Chinese people showed no hesitation whatsoever in inquiring about his collection. These objects, unlike Jesus, were safe to talk about. One day, Corbett had an epiphany. What if he were to expand his collection, converting it into a museum that taught Chinese about the outside world? When Corbett returned to America in 1875 on furlough, he located benefactors willing to make contributions. He also collected scientific and technological exhibits. In China, a wealthy Chinese merchant in Chifu gave him access to a large building that consumed an entire city block. After installing his exhibits, Corbett opened the doors. To attract people, he acted like a carnival barker, beckoning people to step inside and see the wonders of the world. Though the venue was primarily educational, it did advance the gospel. As the price of admission, you had to listen to a sermon. But the Chinese didn't mind, and they came in droves. About 100,000 people visited each year, and Corbett became famous in Shandong. He still traveled through the countryside to spread the gospel, but when he did, he was met with hearty welcomes, not showers of stones. Other missionaries innovated too. In a couple of provinces, missionaries experimented with a new method that involved giving control of churches to Chinese ministers very soon after their training. The logic behind this strategy was as follows. Missionaries recognized that Christianity was a tough sell in China as long as foreigners were the ones selling it. As outsiders from countries that engaged in imperialism and opium trafficking, there was plenty to distrust. Making matters worse was the challenge of integration. Some missionaries conceded that they would never understand Chinese culture in depth and therefore could not possibly integrate Western religion and Chinese culture. That was a job they would leave to their Chinese converts. Since Chinese Christians understood both, missionaries trusted them to figure it out. The missionary would recede to the background and allow Chinese ministers to sell Christianity. The Methodist Episcopal Mission in Fujian province was the most aggressive in practicing this strategy. I'll give you an example to show you how it worked. This is Nathan Seitz. In the 1870s, he was brutally beaten by a mob and nearly died. He only survived because he played dead and the mob eventually left him alone. He figured out that he was of greater use working behind the scenes to train Chinese ministers. He worked with a man who became extremely successful, Hu Yongmi. What is interesting about Hu Yongmi is that he believed deeply in Chinese vernacular religion, and he never stopped. His youth was steeped in gods, ghosts, and demons. In his autobiography, he described his childhood as filled with terror as he lived every day in fear of demons. When he joined the Christian church, he did something that most missionaries would not approve of. He kept his catalog of evil spirits intact, but added God and Jesus to it. In other words, he never stopped believing in demons, but he had faith that God and Jesus would shield him from their malice. This gave him an advantage as he sought to spread Christianity. He was not asking Chinese villagers to delete their belief system and adopt a foreign religion. He was instead giving them access to two new gods, God and Jesus, with the power to improve their lives. Hu Yongmi would even conduct exorcisms to rid people of evil spirits, something that very few missionaries approved of. Now, I mention Hu Yongmi for another reason. Though he did not build a modern institution, his daughter did. This is Hu Qing'eng. When she was a little girl, her mother started to bind her feet until her father intervened. Christians, he said, do not believe in this disfiguring custom, and so we must stop. At an early age, Hu Qing'eng dreamed of becoming a doctor. She admired a female physician from America named Sigourney Trask, who ran a hospital in Fuzhou. Hu Qing'eng, with the approval of her father, trained under Sigourney Trask for several years before Trask decided that her protege, if she were to develop, needed to attend medical school. Trask persuaded the Women's Foreign Missionary Society to fund Hu Qing'eng's education in America. Voyaging to the United States in the 1880s, Hu earned her bachelor's degree at Ohio Wesleyan University and her MD at the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. In the 1890s, Dr. Hu established her own hospital in Fuzhou. Well, let's look briefly at some other missionary transformations. Young J. Allen, he failed to win converts for years before he figured out what his role would be. Allen argued that missionaries, if they were to succeed, needed to focus on two groups: the literati, meaning the highly educated people, and women. Concerning the literati, Allen thought that if you could convert the educated classes, their influence would cascade downwards, affecting all of society. Allen was certainly not the first to have this idea. The Jesuits of the 1500s and 1600s employed this strategy. But Allen found a new way to reach the literati: a magazine. In 1874, he started publishing the Globe magazine, a Chinese language periodical that informed readers about developments in world affairs, science, religion, and technology. The magazine possessed one other crucial feature: it was interactive. It provided Chinese readers with a forum in which they could share opinions and engage in debate. In fact, the contributions of Chinese readers constituted a major thrust of this magazine. The Globe magazine inspired Chinese intellectuals, including the reformers Kang Youwei and Liang Chirchiao, who of course was the subject of a wonderful event by the China Institute 2 weeks ago. Another reformer, Huang Naishang, became young J. Allen's close friend and published a magazine of his own patterned off of Allen's magazine. Along with his magazine, Allen innovated in education. I said a moment ago that he targeted not just elite people, but women. In 1892, he established a one-of-a-kind school in Shanghai that reached both groups at once, the McTeer School. This was a school for girls from elite families. It attracted the children of government officials, military officers, and business leaders. Its most famous alumni are the daughters of Charlie Soong. Now let's stay with education, because schools and colleges were the most influential of the institutions founded by missionaries. Mission schools exploited a gap in the Chinese educational system. During the Qing dynasty, Chinese boys could receive an education in a variety of ways. An affluent family might hire a private tutor for their son. A clan could set up a school for its members. And in some villages, residents would pool together resources to hire a teacher. But what could parents do if they were too poor for any of these options? The government did establish charitable schools, but its coverage left massive gaps. By the 1870s, population growth had exceeded school capacity to the point where most boys lacked the chance to receive any education at all. In short, when it came to education, demand outstripped supply. One missionary couple who figured this out was Calvin and Julia Matier. The Matier School in Shandong province carved out a niche by catering to Chinese families who had fallen through the cracks. Now, the Matiers did not start out focusing on education. When the couple first reached China in 1863, the plan was for Calvin to travel around on a horse spreading the gospel. He did that for many years. He tried hard, but like so many others, he failed. For example, in 1866, he invested great effort in preparing a chapel to serve the people of a town. On opening day, when he thrust open the doors, he was greeted by a hailstorm of rocks. But that was not the worst of it. Vandals desecrated the nearby missionary graveyard, and townspeople paraded through the streets demanding that he leave. After years devoid of progress, Calvin Matier decided to stop trying to force Christianity on the Chinese. You know the saying, you get more flies with honey than with vinegar. Well, the Matiers opened a free boarding school for Chinese boys. At first, the school struggled. That was because it did not teach what most Chinese parents wanted. The school taught math, science, history, Christianity, and the Chinese language. It did not teach the Confucian classics, and so it did not prepare students to take the civil service examination. That was a real drawback because schools were measured by the performance of their graduates on those exams. In the 1870s, the Matiers got smart. They hired Confucian scholars to teach and altered the curriculum so that the school prepared students for the examination. They then convinced their top student to take the exam, and he, to their relief, passed. Over the next decade, 17 other students would take the exam and 16 would pass, giving the school excellent publicity. In this way, it earned the trust of the community. In the 1880s, the Matiers did something quite bold. They expanded the facility, added upper-level coursework, and brought in new equipment, such as a high-powered telescope. They then converted the school into a college. Tongzhou College was one of the first Christian colleges in China. And thanks to Calvin Matier, it specialized in what we would call STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. Matier himself taught some of the science, math, and engineering courses, and he wrote dozens of textbooks because this knowledge existed in English and Matir wanted to teach in Chinese. Therefore, he had to translate Western textbooks into Chinese or sometimes write entirely new textbooks. However, much of the teaching at Tongzhou College was done by graduates. The college retained every graduate for 2 years to train the young man to be a teacher. After that, the school would add the best teachers to its permanent faculty. As for the other graduates, Calvin Matir would place them in government schools across the country. And the college had such a strong reputation, he could do that. Through his students, in other words, he wielded substantial influence over education in China. And by the way, Henry Winters Luce heard about the innovative college while he was studying at Yale. He asked his mission board to send him to Tongzhou College so that he could teach alongside of the great Calvin Matir, and he did. A moment ago, I noted that Tongzhou College was one of the first Christian colleges. It was not the first. That distinction belongs to St. John's College in Shanghai. To understand St. John's, you have to know something about this man, Yen Young Kyung. Born in 1838 to a very poor family in Shanghai, Yen flashed signs of the kind of brilliance that inspires parents to dream. Might their son one day become a high-ranking official? That dream, however, would require expensive schooling in the Confucian classics, something Yen's father could not afford. Fearful that the boy's talent would go to waste, the parents made the fateful decision to enroll him in an Episcopal boarding school run by Bishop William Boone. Better to send him to a Christian school, they reasoned, than to no school at all. But it was at this point that the parents lost control of Yen's destiny. For though he would rise, it would be along a non-Confucian track. At the missionary school, Yen impressed his American teachers with his precocious intellect, so much so that the mission decided to invest in his future. When Boone returned to the United States in the 1850s, he took Yen with him. He placed Yen in Kenyon College in Ohio. At Kenyon, Yen played sports, joined a secret society, and dominated the curriculum. Well, while I was researching for the book, I wrote Kenyon to see if they had any records on him, and they sent me his report cards. You can look at one of them here, and you can see that he took tough classes like calculus and Greek and German, and he received very high marks, usually a 10 out of 10 or a 9 3/4 out of 10. The school made him valedictorian when he graduated in 1861. Returning to China, Yen discovered that 7 years in America had altered him profoundly. He had acquired a hybrid identity, one that fused together Chinese and American traits. He also realized how extraordinarily rare he was. Very few people like him walked the earth. Missionaries, of course, saw value in Yen's bilingual and bicultural identity. Yen, after all, could move effortlessly between Chinese and American communities. To them, he seemed like a prototype for a new kind of missionary, a kind of secret weapon of God. Except Yen did not feel like a weapon. What he felt was lonely. He had lived overseas for too long, and now he was paying the price. He could no longer relate to his fellow Chinese. and American missionaries failed to comprehend his inner turmoil. As he started his missionary career in China, he felt deeply depressed. But instead of quitting, Yen hunkered down. Over time, he found ways to express his talent through the missionary apparatus. He engaged in some conventional preaching and translation work. For example, he translated Herbert Spencer, the famous British philosopher, into Chinese a decade before Yan Fu famously did so. However, Yen's largest contribution lay in education. He loved Kenyon College and aspired to give Chinese youth access to a comparable education. When the mission founded St. John's College in 1879, it looked to Yen. He was the only person who understood both the American college system and the needs of the Chinese student. He became the college's first dean, shaping the institution during its formative period. Using Kenyon as his model, he wrote the college's curriculum, built its administrative apparatus, taught many of the early classes, defined the college's culture, and formed its vision. St. John's was not an immediate success. Most Christian colleges struggled with low enrollments in the 1880s and early 1890s. There were not enough Christian students to fill the dormitories, which meant that a college had to attract non-Christian students. And that posed a challenge because Chinese families saw Christian colleges as too risky for their sons. All that changed in 1895 with the Sino-Japanese War. Though I don't have time to describe this war in detail, it suffices to say that Japan's victory shook the foundations of Chinese intellectual culture. The popular perception of Christian colleges changed overnight. In the war's aftermath, many Chinese saw these institutions in a new light as incubators of modernization. The colleges, they realized, offered rigorous training in the exact subjects the Chinese now coveted in their quest for national renewal: science, math, engineering, chemistry, English. After the war, St. John's noticed a surge in applications. The college president, Francis Hawks Pott, explained it like this. He said, "One reason for the greater interest was the result of the war between China and Japan. It was logical for the Chinese to conclude that Japan's superior strength was largely due to the introduction of modern education." End quote. More students meant more money, which the college used to upgrade its facilities. It added dormitories, classroom buildings, laboratories, and athletic facilities. Along with its physical complex, St. John's started to resemble a traditional American college in other ways too. Expanding its emphasis on physical culture, the school offered tennis, track, baseball, and football. St. John's also led a group of colleges in forming an athletic association, a very American kind of organization. The annual football game between St. John's and Nanyang College was called the Harvard and Yale game of the Far East. Along with sports, St. John's acquired other hallmarks of the American college. The 1890s gave birth to Echo, the first ever student-run English language magazine in China. Students enjoyed other extracurricular activities. There was a Shakespeare club, a photography club, a glee club, and a literary and debating society. In the 20th century, St. John's graduates went on to become industrialists, engineers, physicians, statesmen, educators, filmmakers, and intellectuals. They were some of the builders of modern China. Though Yen Yongkyung did not live to see the impact of St. John's, he died in 1898, his family members did. His son, W.W. Yen, studied at the University of Virginia before returning to China to teach at St. John's. He then went on to edit China's commercial press, a major conduit for Western knowledge, and he served as president of the Republic of China in the 1920s. Like his father, W.W. Yen also helped develop a college, Tsinghua, which is today an elite university. Yen Yongkyung's nephew, F.C. Yen, graduated from St. John's before going on to Yale Medical School. When he returned to China, he helped to establish both Yale's medical school in Hunan province and the Shanghai Medical College of Fudan University. He also became the vice president of the Peking Union Medical College, and he served as Minister of Public Health in the 1930s. So that is the story that I'm sharing with you tonight. How you interpret it is, of course, up to you. For many decades, the knee-jerk reaction in academics was to view these missionaries in a negative light. The term that you most often heard was cultural imperialism. And I will confess that during my research, I came to respect many of these missionaries and the courageous Chinese with whom they worked. That being said, I do not mean to imply that these other academics were wrong in labeling them cultural imperialists. I mean, if we were to somehow summon Absalom Seidenstricker from the past and ask him if his intention had been to impose Christianity onto Chinese culture, he would surely say, yes, that is exactly what I meant to do. And he wouldn't apologize for it either. So yes, Absalom and others too, I think, meet the basic criteria of a cultural imperialist. However, I don't think the academic discussion is all that simple. Back in 1980, the great Chinese historian Jonathan Spence eloquently remarked that missionary activity took place in that indefinable realm where altruism and exploitation meet. Missionaries, Spence implies, are too complicated to dismiss as simple imperialists. And that would be my view also. And so what I'd like to do now is list some of the complicating factors. First, most missionaries came to love China, calling it their home. And so they were outraged by the injustices that they witnessed. They despised the opium trade, condemned the imperial powers for carving China up, and vehemently opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States. Second, these men and women showed the capacity to change. They may have come to China as religious zealots who referred to the Chinese as, quote, heathens, but they altered course mid-career. Many came to appreciate China's culture and intellectual heritage. You would be amazed, if you read deeply into missionary writings, you would be amazed at how many of them became fans of Confucius and Mencius. Third, missionaries built the institutions discussed tonight to promote Christianity. However, in this regard, they were often not very effective. The Chinese showed a strong capability to pick and choose from American options. Many Chinese said, I'll take your science and engineering, but I'll pass on the gospel. My point is that the Chinese had more power in this negotiation than the term cultural imperialism implies. Fourth, missionaries encouraged a high degree of Chinese agency. As we penetrate the 20th century, we find Chinese in positions of leadership and authority in most of the churches, colleges, hospitals, medical schools, and YMCA chapters. Though it is impossible to know for sure, many of these people would likely have lived obscure lives had there been no American institutions for them to rise up in. So they had some real power. Fifth and last, these institutions exposed China to modernity in mostly friendly ways. It is one thing to learn about modernity because a Japanese or Western warship is bombarding your city. It is another thing to sit in a college classroom and watch Henry Winters Luce perform a science demonstration, or to receive a life-saving surgery in a mission hospital. There was, in other words, a real educational mission and a real humanitarian mission within the larger Christian mission. Sometimes I see these missionary institutions as the historical antecedents of present-day organizations like the Peace Corps or Doctors Without Borders. If you were a young man in the 1890s and you went to college, your college probably taught you to care about the world. And the people who decided that they did care, well, how would they help the world? The only game in town back then was missionary institutions. And so that's what they availed themselves of. All right. Thank you very much for listening to me and listening to this presentation. So I really appreciate you for being a wonderful audience. And I'll stop right there and certainly take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Before Liu Chang comes in, let me just mention that in our audience is a distinguished professor from Nanjing, and he's a friend of Professor Haddad, and he's a friend of me and Professor Yao Junwei, and he's an expert on pearl buck, among other things. Yao Jiaoshou, do you want to appear on camera? We will give you the first question to ask. But Jiang, you can actually read his question in the chat box if you prefer.
Okay. Let's see. I'm scrolling through.
Maybe toward the end.
It's near the end. Okay. Oh, yes, I see it. Yes. Junwei and I are listening to your talk. Junwei has one question. Pearl Buck wrote 2 biographies, Fighting Angel for her father. As we understand it, her father is a fighting angel for God. But at the same time, can we say that she is also fighting against her father, against the missionary work? That's to say, fighting angel means fighting against her father. What do you think? Wow, yeah. I think you're right, Junwei. That, first of all, that is a wonderful book. And for anyone who wants to have a brilliant author like Pearl Buck show you what the missionary experiment was like in the late 19th century and early 20th century. If you want to sort of follow a missionary as he heads out on all these adventures, that is the book for you. It's called Fighting Angel. And then she wrote another book about her mom called The Exile, because her mom Carrie Seidenstricker never really felt at home in China. Pearl Buck is a wonderful author because she is conflicted. You know, one thing I've learned about literature, I teach a lot of English classes at Penn State Harrisburg, and one thing I learned is that people who have no issues, no conflicts in their lives, don't write great literature. It's people who have this inner tension inside their minds. Those people need to turn to pen and paper to resolve their inner conflicts, to work things out. And I think Junwei is exactly right. I think she loved her father. I mean, when she was a little girl, she idolized him. But as she grew older and she became more worldly, I think she saw his mission on the Chinese countryside as very, very narrow. And so I think he's a fighting angel, and I believe you're right, she was fighting him at the same time. I think she had to achieve independence from him in order to establish herself as an intellectual.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haddad. So here are several other questions. So I would just ask you both in English and in Chinese. So probably some of our audience who's not good at English and who could also understand the main meaning of your questions. So one question is, there are missionaries from different countries, European countries mainly, in addition to the US ones. My question is, are there any communication coordination among them? Do they support each other? If yes, in what way? So basically, this question is about 除了美国的传教士之外，还有来自不同国家的传教士，尤其是欧洲国家的。所以这位观众朋友的问题是，他们之间是否有任何的沟通和协调，以及他们之间是否有互相的支持？那么如果有，是以什么样的方式呢？那我们接下来就请这个海达德博士为大家来解答一下。Okay, thank you. Please.
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, there was lots of coordination. You know, so I've read a lot of missionary sources. And one reason why I kind of moved away from the imperialism argument is because I just wasn't seeing these Americans saying, or British saying anything jingoistic. They didn't seem to really be pro-American. They didn't see themselves as an extension of American empire or anything like that. It was really, in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, it was really about the gospel, about spreading Christianity. So they weren't thinking too much about the nation state from which they came from. They were thinking about religion. Well, there they find themselves in China, and there are missionaries from other countries there, French, Germans, British, and they're kind of the same way. Often they're embarrassed by the behavior of merchants or diplomats or gunboats in China. They don't want to be associated with their home countries. Who do they affiliate with? They affiliate with the other missionaries because they mostly see the world the same way. So I never found like a mission that was kind of became a fusion of, say, British or American. That didn't happen. There were British missionary organizations and there were American missionary organizations. However, what you do see is partnerships between the two. Boy, just the other day, I was right now I'm doing some research on missionaries who spread science in the early 20th century, and I was reading about how the YMCA was trying to borrow a famous British missionary who in Shandong province had built this wonderful science museum, and the YMCA wanted to teach science too. So they said, let's see if we can bring him under the YMCA umbrella. So yeah, I think there were partnerships. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you so much. So, 那么刚才海达德博士他就是同意说，那么他们之间一定是有就是这个沟通以及联系，以及他们相互支持的。那么由于我们今天的时间有限哈，所以可能我们具体的内容呢就不为大家来进行翻译了。那么我们相信今天观众朋友的大家的语言水平也都是很高的哈，所以我们还是以这个英语为主来进行我们今天的这个问题的回答。Okay, so the next question is, did they turn from evangelical efforts to modern institution building by missionaries in China have anything to do with the social gospel movement in the U.S.? 所以就是中国的传教士从福音派的努力转向到现代机构的这样的一个建设，就是我们可以理解成是世俗的领域，是否和美国这个社会福音的运动有关系呢？那么，请我们海达德教授来为我们进行解答，谢谢。Thank you.
Another wonderful question. The answer is yes. Interesting. You kind of see a generational divide in missionaries. So the ones who came in the 1860s and 1870s, the social gospel movement hadn't started yet. And so they're really just purely evangelical. It is about saving souls. They're not interested in public health or curing the body or alleviating poverty or anything like that. It's about souls and only souls. Then the missionaries who come later in, like, say, the 1890s and early 1900s, America has changed a lot in those 20 or 30 years there, a single generation. That period witnessed the expansion of big cities and all the problems that we associate with big cities. There was a mass immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, migrants coming to take jobs in the Industrial Revolution. So all this change and flux in America kind of compelled Christianity to pivot, change directions, and say, okay, we're still very much about saving souls, but we've got to kind of do some charitable work also to take care of these people. So missionaries who came, 1890s or 1900, they were shaped by the social gospel mission objective, and they brought it with them to China and wished to carry out social gospel objectives. And they were, of course, thrilled by the hospitals and schools and colleges and things like that, because those were conducive to the social gospel. I'll also add one thing before we get to the next question, and that is that I put into the chat a little quick note telling the audience how they can not just find the book if they want to read it, but get 25% off. So I put in the website, the link that takes you right to it, and a code that you punch that in and you get 25% off. So please do so.
This is such a good news, right? This is very nice. So if anyone interested in the book, and you can use the this discount code to purchase this. It's going to be very interesting to read this, I believe. And thank you, Dr. Haddad. Okay, so here's the next question, very interesting. And so this audience asked, so since building institutions is something the missionaries have to do for elevating the resistance of Chinese people, surely that works quite well in many cases. But my wonder is whether this universities has also produced some results with which went completely against the original intention to the missionaries. Thank you a lot. 就是很多这个传教机构啊，它是为了减轻中国人的抵抗而做的事情。但是呢，在很多情况，虽然在很多情况下它的这个效果非常好，但是呢，这些大学是否也产生了一些完全违背传教士初衷的结果？那么我们来请这个海达德教授为我们来解答一下。Thank you.
Yeah, boy, I can say that the China Institute draws a really informed audience, because these are superb questions. that was a real issue. So the general answer, and then I'll give you a specific example, but the general answer is that the institutions they founded, the universities, the colleges, did go off in a direction that the founders had not intended. So when the colleges were founded, and the first ones appear, St. John's is the first in 1879, then there's a handful of others in the 1880s. It really was, how can we, create a better mousetrap to catch more Chinese and turn them to Christianity? So it was, even though it was teaching math and science and so on, it was still evangelical, and most of the students were Christian. But as the decades rolled by, what we see is kind of a secularization of these institutions. Then by the time you get to the 1920s and 1930s, they're still kind of nominally Christian. I'd say the colleges have a sort of vague Christian culture, but most of the students aren't Christian, and there's absolutely no pressure on the students to convert to Christianity, and there's no benefits that would accrue to them if they did convert. A really interesting guy is John Leighton Stewart, who was he was a missionary himself. His parents were missionaries, and he became the president of Yenching College for many years. And Yenching eventually joined with other institutions and became Beijing University. But that was his philosophy, was, we will sort of have a generally Christian moral atmosphere, but that's about it. We're not going to try to convert anybody. Now, a specific example. If you read the debates between these colleges in, say, 1890, there is one topic that got fiercely combative, and that was the teaching of English. Some colleges wanted to teach English because they knew English would be popular, like especially if you're a college in, say, Shanghai. They knew that they could attract students if they offered English, because Chinese would want to learn English and then get jobs in business, in international business.
Yeah.
So the colleges there wanted to offer English. I mentioned Calvin Mateer up there in Shandong province. He said, no way, no how, that's the destruction of our college if we do that. Because he knew that what would happen is, if English were taught, the Chinese would learn English, and they would learn not just his curriculum, but they'd learn all the bad stuff coming out of Europe and America, and that would ruin them. And he also thought that what they would do is simply come to the college, ignore Christianity, take their English language, and go get jobs. And what good was that? And so he kept English out of Tengzhou College. And actually, the person who finally brought English to that college was Henry Winters Luce. So it was about maybe a year before Calvin Mateer died. He must have been very upset watching Henry Winters Luce bring in English language teaching to that college. So yes, sometimes the colleges started out one way, very Christian, and then they secularized.
Okay, thank you so much. And so here's another question. It's about several famous names in history that a lot of Chinese people are familiar with. So the question is, so what is your comment on the experience of American missionaries and the early Western missionaries like Mateo Ricci, Johann Adams, Scull, Vobel? Excuse me if my pronunciation is bad.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but a lot of these names as a missionaries, actually, Chinese people are very familiar with. Actually, a lot of them, like they end their life in China, so they, kind of like spend their most of life there. So, what is your comments on this people, these missionaries?
Well, the Jesuits are fascinating. And if you want to read about them, and you want to read it from a historian who's just a gifted storyteller, read Jonathan Spence. He has he has one book called To Change China, which has it's about, I think, from around 1980. That's got a full chapter on the Jesuits, and really good. And then he has a whole book on Matteo Ricci, called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. So he covers really well that in colorful language and storytelling, the Jesuits. Yeah, this was another debate. It wasn't an ugly debate, but it was a debate among missionaries, which is, how should you approach, you have this task, you've got to try to convert 300 million, 400 million Chinese people to Christianity, and they wanted to do it really fast because they thought that God wanted to bring about the second coming, and that God wouldn't bring about the second coming of Jesus until China was converted to Christianity. So how do you do it? You've got seemingly a Herculean task before you to convert all those people. And the debate was, should we imitate the Jesuits and try to reach the ruling class? And that's what Matteo Ricci and Shaw did. They got inside the Forbidden City. The emperor knew who they were. They became advisors of the emperor. They did it by like predicting eclipses and things like that. So they would use science to sort of to show the power of Western knowledge. And the hope was that if you could convert the ruling class and the literati, they had so much influence over everybody else in a hierarchical society that Christianity would just, the conversion would happen by itself. And then the other philosophy was like what Absalom Seidenstricker was doing, which is simply trying to plant seeds. So he wasn't working much with officials. In fact, he probably disliked them. He went out to the ordinary people, and he was trying to show them, ordinary people, that Christianity is a religion that cares about you. It understands your suffering. And his hope would be that he would plant these churches, and once he had several churches planted, that it would become kind of a machine that would reproduce itself. If you have 15 or 20 churches and they all have robust congregations, well, they eventually start producing new ministers, and those ministers go to new towns and they start churches in those towns, and Christianity would become a mass movement, and it would mushroom across China in that way. So yes, missionaries were very cognizant of who came before them, and they had these two basic strategies that I just laid out.
Thank you so much. So here is another question, very interesting. Actually, I'm very curious about that. So I have several very good Korean friends. So they graduated from religious middle school, even universities. So here's the one thing that we're wondering: why has the evangelical work so much more successful in Korea, especially South Korea? And given both the China and the Korea has the deep influenced by the Confucius study. So, but why and now the impact of the missionaries in South Korea and China different? So can you try to explore for us?
I don't have a good answer, but I can comment. So when missionaries wrote a lot, and because they wrote a lot, there's voluminous sources. And as a historian, you're trying to keep track of it all. And there's just so much stuff that if you're not careful, you'll just be reading and not writing your book. And a project might take a decade or more. So while I'm reading about American missionaries in China, I would notice from time to time that many of them would shoot off to Korea, they were starting churches there too. One of them, a guy named John Nevius, who was a missionary in Shandong province. He would have been a colleague of Calvin Mathieu and Hunter Corbett. He came up with something called the Nevius method, And the Nevius method was essentially, it was similar to that, to what I spoke about, where you would empower Chinese ministers, but then the missionary would remain behind the scenes and let the Chinese minister do the work of trying to integrate Korean culture with Christianity or Chinese culture with Christianity. So the Nevius plan, he invented it in China, but it became very successful in Korea. Now, as I said, as I was researching, I would see these missionaries make these forays out to Korea, but I kept saying, come on, John, that looks interesting, but you got to stay on task here. Otherwise, you're never going to get this done. So I kind of trained myself not to look over at Korea, and I'm embarrassed about that now because of your wonderful question. You know what? When you ask a question like that, that's a book. When you have a question like, why did it take off more in this Asian country than it did in the other Asian country? I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that, but I think you could build a research plan to figure it out. But that's not me, at least not yet.
Okay, thank you. But at least I'm wondering that you can mainly explain a little bit, the differences between, probably China, Japan, Korea, and even Southeast Asia, like what impact the differences or the different outcomes of the like the missionaries, like the work, on the different countries. So just the several, important factors.
Yeah. So I'd say, Korea's probably the most successful. Then China, which you wouldn't say that Christian missionaries were very successful in China when it came to converts. You could say that they were quite successful as institution builders and modernizers, but not in terms of converts. And then Japan, I would say the least progress of all. In fact, in Japan, the missionaries in China actually got quite frustrated with Japan. As everybody in this audience knows, Japan has that remarkable modernization, in the Meiji Revolution, and it goes, in a very short space of time, from being kind of a feudal country with samurai warriors to a country as modern as a European nation or America.
Exactly. It's sort of confusing.
It's amazing. It's one of the most astounding things in history.
Yeah.
But Japan was a real thorn in the side of American missionaries because it was so successful over there, just across the water, and the young Chinese whom the Americans were trying to inspire with like YMCA chapters, they had another option. They were interested in Japan too. Japan was very impressive to them, and a lot of young Chinese students and a few intellectuals would go over to Japan and learn the Japanese way. And that was very, very frustrating to American missionaries who I think wanted to have a monopoly on Westernization.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So yeah, I guess there are a lot of reasons, factors that we can explore. So the next question, and also very interesting. So, since
maybe the last question.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Since our time is very limited, so probably we'll just pick, the last question, and for Dr. Hadid. So let me see which question. Okay, so probably this question, I guess, is more like familiar for most of the people. So since that, establish the school and hospitals, is kind of the main strategy for most of missionaries. So the question is this strategy also can apply to the other countries with respect to the, spreading gospel? So it happened in China, obviously. So and also, in some other countries, as what I know, that I lived in Indonesia for a while. But I'm wondering if this strategy is kind of like a globally, or it's generally, or just they have a specific strategy to different countries. Thank you.
Boy, these questions are sort of inspiring me to sort of look more closely at comparative religion and comparative missions, and not just to focus exclusively on China to the exclusion of other countries. As I said to the last question, I wouldn't be an expert on that, and whether missionaries in Indonesia or Africa or South America were behaving in the same way as they did in China. I would say I'm sure that they were building schools and hospitals. I mean, that I'm certain. I would say, though, that the missionary project in China, for some reason, developed kind of a mystique, and maybe it's Henry Luce has something to do with it. What kind of emerged in the early to mid 20th century was that China and the United States were heading towards this amazing partnership, and that missionaries would be the brokers of that partnership, that they would become great friends. China would become very much sort of a Christian kind of nation, open to American ideas and knowledge, and American goods. So there would be trade, there would be partnerships between the two. They would be fast friends, and that was one of the dreams of Henry Luce. And he used his publishing to try to make that happen and to promote that idea. Of course, the communists had something to say about that, and so 1949 happened, and that dream completely collapsed. But I think if you look to what American intellectuals were saying in 1949 and 1950, is they were just in agony that something with so much potential had been destroyed. And I think their pain and heartache really speaks to the colossal size of that dream. So in answer to your question, I think missionaries were doing the same kind of stuff in multiple countries, but there's something special about China, in the imagination of Americans.
Okay, thank you. If I may ask the last question, I mean, literally the last question, actually, I just thought about that. It's very interesting. So when I lived in China, and actually I made some, like the Western friends, actually they're sort of the modern missionary right now. But I mean, instead of, the time back to 50 years ago, and they built the school, and they built the church, and like the hospitals, and now it's more kind of exchange, I guess, sort of the small group, they did the nice events or whatever. So my question is like, what's the trend nowadays? I mean, like if we define these people still kind of missionaries, so what's the trend of activities they're doing right now? And so what's the goal, and what's the mission or vision for them to do nowadays in the overseas, for sort of the same type of activities?
My sense, Liu Chang, is that there are sort of some cooperative activities and partnerships that continue today that look very similar to the sorts of institutions and exchanges that I've been talking about tonight, or that you would find in the book. I'm going to guess that I'm not too connected with the missionary movement now. I'm not entirely sure. When I lived in China, I did meet missionaries, so I know they were there, but I'm not exactly sure how welcome they were or how influential they were in China of today. So I would defer to others on that question. However, I would say that the kinds of activities that missionaries were doing has continued Only now it's sort of it tends to fall under the aegis of universities and cosmopolitanism and globalization. So, for example, many universities, Penn State, we have great ties with China. Duke has a campus in China. NYU has a campus in China, and others as well. So it seems like the universities have picked up where the missionaries left off and are continuing that kind of work. And I would also say that it's now much more of a two-way street than it was back then. There were, if you look very carefully at the 19th century and early 20th century, you'll find Chinese in America who are spreading Chinese culture. They're giving public lectures and things like that. They're there, but it's small. Whereas in China, the Americans doing that, it's quite a large movement with a lot of resources behind it. But now I think it's pretty even now. China's very good about promoting Chinese culture in Europe and America and around the world, and likewise. So, and again, it seems to be done mostly by governmental and universities. Oh, by the way, you said that was the last question, but I did want to invite anyone. I put my email in the chat box. If anyone has a question, or let's say they leave tonight and they forgot to write down that code, and they want to get in touch with me, they can just write to my email, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haddad. So as what we just mentioned, and so if anybody wanted to explore further about this topic, and so since we don't have enough time, and then you're welcome to to try to buy the book and to read and to explore by yourself. I'm sure you're going to learn much more from this lecture. But so we're very, very honored and to have Dr. Haddad for to having you tonight and to join this lecture. So I learned a lot personally. Thank you so much.
Well, the honor is all mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. 好，那现在我切换回中文哈。那我们今天的讲座呢，因为时间有限，所以我们到这里不得不结束了。那相信我们的观众朋友们呢，还是有很多的问题，所以呢，如果大家对我们今天的话题非常感兴趣的话，那我们海达德教授呢，也为大家留下了他的邮箱地址，以及他的这个书籍的一些链接，所以大家有兴趣的话，可以给海达德教授发送邮件，以及来购买他的书籍，来进行一些这个进一步的探索和阅读。那么非常感谢大家今天参与我们的讲座活动。那么在我们活动结束之前呢，我们还是按照惯例给大家来介绍一下我们下一次的讲座。我们下一次讲座呢，将会是在3月25日晚8点到9点半，也就是北京时间的3月26日早8点到9点半。所以这里呢，我们提醒一下我们的观众朋友们，我们的这个冬令时呢将在明天的凌晨结束，所以我们下一次的讲座呢，这个北京时间还有美国东部时间的时差将调整回到12个小时。那所以如果现在身在这个亚洲以及这个中国的朋友们，大家可以呢及时调整一下您下一次来收看我们讲座的时间。那我们下一次讲座的这个主题呢，将是以一门双杰吴祖光和吴祖强他们兄弟二人哈，那么也是我们这个中国历史上非常著名的这个一对兄弟组合。那么给我们带来这个讲座的这位讲座人呢，他其实不是别人，也是吴家的一个非常亲的亲人哈，就是他们的侄 nephew 的这样的一位先生哈，所以呢，以他的这个视角为我们独家这个提供关于这个吴祖光和吴祖强先生的一些这个他们的生平事迹，所以大家如果对这个话题感兴趣，一定不要错过我们下一次的讲座。好，那我们今天的讲座呢到这里就结束了。再一次非常非常感谢我们今天的讲座嘉宾这个海达德教授。那么这个 So Dr. Haddad is in Philadelphia, right? Pennsylvania.
Lancaster.
Lancaster.
Not far from Philadelphia.
Is it Pennsylvania?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so thank you so much again for joining us tonight. So and Dr. Haddad is in Pennsylvania, and Dr. Yong Ho and me are in New York. And so we would love to say thank you so much for joining us, and wish you a good night and a good day in New York or in China. And so we're very looking forward to having you next week to join. Next time to join us. Thank you so much for joining this event, and so we'll see you next time. 非常感谢大家，那我们下一次活动再见，谢谢。Thank you. Have a good night.